Hey everybody. So I'm not a professional YouTuber or anything like that. I'm just kind of bunked up just because of the whole coronavirus thing. Unfortunate situation. No matter what you think about it, I know there's a lot of weird stuff kind of going on. It's easy to think a lot of weird things and whatnot. People are unfortunately passing away, but there's always a reason, but there's always something behind the background. But I'm not going to really get too much into that really right now. um, One of the things that I would like to do is, so there's a couple books. I've just been going on like Amazon splurges since probably like 2016, and this is a book. It's called JD Salinger and the Nazis by Eberhard Alsen, and this is actually from the University of Wisconsin Press. So this isn't some like fringe right wing uh, conspiracy video or anything like that or book. But this is very interesting because I think it puts JD Salinger into perspective a little bit better. I think particularly you can almost treat this video as like disproving the conspiracy elements around JD Salinger. I think that within conspiracy culture, they always want to kind of throw um, JD Salinger in there, like Catcher in the Rye was a mind control book or something, something wild, something that would easily make people just not really take the truth of what was behind all this seriously. So this is where like conspiracy theory almost becomes like a weapon in itself to divert from the actual truth. JD Salinger, according to this book, and Alsen does a very good job. He actually starts from his early days to his college days to his military days in the U.S. Army, and he was in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Command, the CIC. Um, and I think because of that, and I think because of the impact of Catcher in the Rye after the post World War II period, um, just the sheer amount of impact that that book had, particularly at inspiring a few people who use violence. I think that people unfortunately kind of threw J.D. Salinger under the bus by calling it a conspiracy theory book. When in fact, though, J.D. Salinger was on the periphery of a real life conspiracy, which actually had to do with, Nazis, the OSS, the CIA, Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip, everybody knows about that. But it goes much deeper than that because I think that when people talk about Operation Paperclip, they typically always think about, Werner von Braun, the space program, all this type of stuff, but it just kind of stops there and it really doesn't. You can almost think of it as multiple Operation Paperclips. There were the people who were brought in to do rocket science and aeronautics, hypoxia studies for whatnot for high altitude flight and everything like that. Yes, they were definitely brought in. The Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. You have Cocoa Beach, Florida. I used to live there as a kid. Right across the bay from NASA. You have the what I call the SoCal complex. So you have Los Angeles, Vanderburg, Edwards. You have Texas corridor. So you have a lot of aviation and space travel, also in like Houston, Texas, Dallas, Texas, or whatnot. But besides all of the Operation Paperclip things, the CIA also held an intelligence apparatus with former Nazis to help almost lay this global intel network to help the United States and the West be a superpower, excuse me, particularly with the Soviet Union kind of encroaching after, our sort of loose alliance kind of broke apart during the days of like the Berlin airlift and all this type of stuff. But this is a really good book. I highly recommend it. And maybe I can share my screen, but I'm going to go a little more into this. But the ultimate reason why I'm talking about this is because JD Salinger is a periphery character. He was not a direct character or anything like that. When it came to the OSS of like Frank Wisner, also the CIC also had Henry Kissinger, so the famous Secretary of State, who was in all types of crazy stuff when it came to the American Empire and whatnot. Um, But ultimately, what I'm going to talk about is not Operation Paperclip, but how actually third way politics came into the United States, but also importantly, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley actually has roots in these sort of, you could say, CIA Nazi operations. And the crazy thing too is to bear in mind, and this is not anti-Semitic at all. I do not support anti-Semitism. Everybody's equal. There's bad people in all groups. Um, you know, I don't play the identity politics game at all. And the thing is that as uncomfortable as it sounds, is that there were certain factions of Jews who knew what was going on. Like, am I supposed to believe that Henry Kissinger, as a Jewish man, did not know that he was actively partaking in helping import Nazis into the United States of America to help us with our dominance, from aerospace to laying the groundworks of technocracy that would later come? You know, I mean, he still has a consulting group in Washington D.C. Like, this is serious business. Like, it's all, you have to get rid of the whole dialectics. You hear that word a lot nowadays. Dialectics. What is dialectics? Think of it as yin yang, tension, uh, having two groups kind of feed off of each other in order to promote an overarching agenda, basically. So everybody's lost within their own sides of the game, whether it's white, black, Jewish, or Gentile, or the Christian, or whatnot. But there's a higher element to all this. The people at the top control both sides of the coin, and that's just how it works. And it's uncomfortable because I think that from a human perspective, we like things to make sense. We put things into buckets, to discern our reality or whatnot. And, our identity plays a big role in that, in where we fit into the world. So it's easy for an African American to have a bias. It's easy for a white person to have a bias. It's easy for a Jewish person to have a bias. But if you're going to approach these situations, you have to leave all that out the door. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time, or you're going to miss a very big part of the puzzle, and you might actually be perpetuating what's actually going on by not calling out people on your own side, just because of this whole BS tribal, oh, we look alike, so we must be common. Everybody who looks like you is not your brother. You know, that's just the truth. Even before, when we were all separated on our own little continents or whatnot, we were all killing each other, doing all sorts of crazy stuff. So just because we live in a diverse, multicultural, multiracial, which is great, nation or civilization or whatnot, don't get it twisted as if like people who are just different than you are your enemies or whatnot, because people like you might be the ones actually pitting those people against you, and want you to be pitted against them. Like, when I approach these things, when I notice on YouTube, for example, when it comes to a lot of, let's just say, independent journalism, which is a more polite term, that's people who are legitimately trying to research what's going on. But then you also have the conspiracy theorist elements, as well. And within the United States, it typically, let's just be real, it kind of just goes more towards your right wing. Is always about, suspicion of the government, suspicion of diversity, suspicion of change. It's almost just a covert operation for conservatism. And I'm a little conservative myself, you know what I'm saying? In order to give myself a little more context before I kind of go into some more of these books, is I was a military brat. I grew up in the U.S. Army. My father, he was a careerist, Army guy. My mom was in the Army. My brother, my sister were in the Army. I was different. I joined the United States Air Force, so I am a veteran. I serve my country, and I'm proud of it. I love the United States. I love our allies. I mean, I have no bad intentions towards anybody else in the world. But I do know where I stand. And one thing about it is I've lived all over this country. I have Southern roots. I'm a Southern boy by birth and everything. My family is from South Georgia. Miami, all that, Alabama. I'm a Southern boy, but I don't really sound like it because I grew up all over the place. So I lived in Kansas. I've lived in Washington State, beautiful state. I kind of consider that more so home. I've lived in Germany. I lived overseas. When it comes to Mannheim, Heidelberg, Frankfurt, Landstuhl, Wiesbaden, Worms, Baumholder. I know all those places and everything. I know what it's like to be in the military. I know what it's like to grow up in the military. So if anybody's a military brat, shout out to you. When it comes to AFES, all that type of stuff, I know it. BX, PX, NEX, uh, what is it? AFN, Armed Forces Network, where they always used to show all the TV shows from all over the states and whatnot. I know it. I know it. But the one thing about me is as a nomad, as a person who traveled across this country, some of the times I was the only black person in my school. Like I grew up around white people, I grew up around Asians, Hispanics. Other places I grew up, it was 90% African American or black. I know context. You know what I'm saying? I've lived all over the place and I grew up in conservative culture. I know the stars and bars, good old boy, don't tread on me, don't take my guns, suspicious of affirmative action, suspicious of all this. I've heard it all. I've been subject to sleight of hand racial comments or whatnot. But do I hate anybody? No, I don't hate anybody. But I have a duty to make this video because there's not people like me making videos like this. And if they are making videos like this, they're almost just playing the dialectic game that I'm talking about. So if you have, these right wing people making conspiracy videos, people automatically think, oh, I just need to do the opposite on my identity to create some conspiracy videos or independent journalism videos. And I'm not playing that game. This is 100% objective. I don't care about your race. I don't care about your religion. And that's over right now. So, JD Salinger, he was in the CIC. But unlike what some conspiracy theorists want to talk about, him being like a mind control book, which is a little plausible, but the truth of the matter is that JD Salinger was a low ranking sergeant, or actually corporal, who later became sergeant. He wasn't even an officer, even though he had a college education. Just because of the circumstances of the war, a bunch of stuff happened. But he was on the periphery of what was going on with the CIC and the OSS with Frank Wisner and Frank Wisner's ideas. So Frank Wisner is a very important character here. He was the director of operations of the OSS, which later became the CIA. And he had all sorts of elaborate ideas, such as recruiting Russian defectors, known as white Russians, Russians who promoted the liberal democracy over totalitarian communism, for example, in order to defect to the United States. He also supported what we would call the infrastructure, arguably, of stay behind units. Emerjays is what they would call them. So Frank Wisner kind of realized that there was all these ethnic tensions going on in Eastern Europe, East Germany, and whatnot. You have Slavic people, Germanic peoples, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Romanians. All these people had tensions with each other. That went back, centuries. He realized that he could leverage that ability and essentially create almost like stay behind units to help fight the Russians. So let me take a drink here real quick. Excuse me. So he helped to set up like stay behind units, the infrastructure for that. Basically, like hit teams who are just regular people who could be called up and activated just in case the Soviets ever invaded. But the truth of the matter is that invasion never happened. So the CIA was training these hardcore killers, domestic terrorists, basically, with the intelligence apparatuses of the various countries. So like you had the German BND, you had the Italians in the mix and whatnot, and some of those people defected over to the far right. So it's like the CIA was essentially just funding the far right in Europe on the auspices of fighting communism because of the whole, spectrum. Oh my God, communism is on the left, so we need to support the right. But by doing so, they actually encourage Nazism, the far right, domestic terrorists, organized crime. And a lot of these people, for all these, alt-right people or whatnot, thinking that this is so noble, these people were selling drugs. They were selling heroin, in order to get money for arms. They were doing all sorts of stuff. And this is how the world really runs. It's the spider web. And when I talk about, where is it at? So this book right here, right? So Salinger, I'll go into this, how it talks about the CIC, yada, yada, and how it kind of leads to technocracy. I won't go into Operation Paperclip because it's so over talked about or whatnot. We get the point. This is a little more controversial. Hitler's Jewish Soldiers by Bryan Mark Rigg. So it is the untold story of Nazi racial laws and the men of Jewish descent in the German military. So before you think that this is some far right conspiracy book, it is not, because this is a Colby Award winner. So this is a winner. This is a prestigious award to get for military history. And let me read to you about the author himself. So Bryan Mark Rigg received his BA with honors from Yale University and his PhD in history from Cambridge University. Currently an adjunct professor of military history at the American Military University. He has served as a volunteer in the Israeli Army and as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. Semper Fi. So Hitler's Jewish Studies was awarded the Colby Award by the William E. Colby Military Writers Symposium, featured on NBC TV's Dateline. So people have commented from the New York Times, the American Historical Review, Paula Hyman, the author of Gender and Assimilation in Modern Jewish History. So when it comes to any accusations that this might be anti-Semitic video or whatnot, no, this is actually legitimate research. But think about that. Hitler's Jewish soldiers. So whenever we think about World War I, first off, I want to say that the Holocaust did happen, and it was horrible. So any Holocaust deniers, I'm sorry, you're in the wrong place or whatnot. When it comes to the idea of Israel, in a utopian sense, yeah, I support it. But at the same time, the reality of what went down to create Israel and the current reality of how it's sustaining itself, particularly with the marginalization of Palestinians who are people, that's another very sticky situation, and it's unfortunate. And like I said, I have nothing against the Jewish people or anything like that. But this book, it brings up some uncomfortable things, because if you were to stack this up, right, these two books up together, right, you can think that, why did JD Salinger go quote unquote crazy, right? Why did he go crazy? Well, as a Jewish man, I'm sure he had an identity crisis. I mean, when you imagine feeling American your whole life, assimilated into America, the melting pot theory, what we're kind of told to do, which I actually kind of promote. I don't really believe in race or anything like that. I don't really care. It exists, of course, but whatever. But just so imagine him as an aspiring young man who wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be the Hemingway. But he also wanted to serve his country like a lot of young men of that time did. But then all of a sudden he finds himself over in Europe, and he actually goes to a concentration camp. And he witnesses all the carnage, all the charred bodies. As a Jewish man who felt like a Western man, quote unquote, even though Jewish people are Western people, just like African Americans are Western people. But let's just say Western in the sense of, he how can I even phrase that right? He felt Western in the sense of he didn't really feel a strong, hardcore attachment to his ethnicity. He felt it more towards his nationality, which was American. that probably had that had a traumatic impact on him, just to see what humans were capable of, and particularly what they were capable of towards people like him. Even though he felt like he was more of a man of the West, but the West did this to his people. So when it comes to the passion that Jewish people have when it comes to defending themselves, I understand. I totally bow down to that. So, but a little more crazy things happen. So he's a minor character, right? But if you go back to this book right here, this makes it sound like there were Jewish people who knew what was going to happen to the Jewish people. And some of them actually participated, unfortunately, sadly, within the extermination of some of their own people. Why? I can only speculate. Maybe some of these people felt more German than they did Jewish or whatnot. Or maybe people realized that the Holocaust was unfortunately, sadly, the only way to force Aliyah back to Israel. You know? And let me talk about that for a minute. So everybody talks about the Rothschilds, right? The Rothschilds this, the Rothschilds that, conspiracy. Yeah, they're real. I mean, they've been business, and this is my theory. So World War I happened, but a lot of weird things happened before World War I. For example, Tito, Stalin, Hitler, Freud, all of these people actually all lived in Vienna. Vienna was the intellectual hotspot to be in of the late 1800s, the early 19th century, or whatnot. I mean, this gave us psychology. That era. You had a Ludwig Wittgenstein or whatnot. One of the most famous linguistic philosophers ever. Like, was it like the limits of my language is the limits of my reality or whatnot? A very profound, deep statement to say, which is kind of true. But anyway, a lot of weird stuff was going down before World War I. And so, for example, you have King George in England, you have Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, and you have Tsar Nicholas in Russia. And all three of these men are cousins. They're cousins, as crazy as that is. And I think that Queen Victoria is the link between them all, because I think like Queen Victoria had so many kids, and some of them married back into the Germans because they have a very strong German tie. Some of them married into the Russian line or whatnot. So you had these three cousins who all pretty much look alike ruling Europe, but they still had their own little petty beefs with one another, whatnot. You can almost say World War I was basically like the last major royal war ever, visibly at least. And think about it this way. So in Germany and Russia, for example, the Jews were treated very badly. They were treated horribly. I mean, particularly in Russia, the Pale settlements, the Baltic kind of Slavic areas, they were treated horribly. I mean pogroms, Cossacks, just raiding into their tiny little villages where they're just trying to live their lives, being burned down, raped, people, just mass murder of innocent people was going on. And this was under Tsar Nicholas's watch. So elements of Jewish people had a beef with the Tsar to begin with, just like they had a beef with the Kaiser or whatnot, due to just centuries of anti-Semitism dating back to the Crusades. Peter the Hermit and the Crusades of like the 1000s. So for 1,000 years they've been persecuted. So what was it when Pope Leo or whatnot uh, activated the Crusades in the 1000s? All of a sudden, this crazy Alex Jones hermit guy named Peter the Hermit was going around blaming the Jews, and people back then weren't very smart. So what do? They just killed a bunch of Jews. And a lot of the princes who were trying to fund their crusade to make it to Jerusalem from areas like France and Belgium, like Godfrey of Bouillon, Godfrey the Crusader, one of the famous Crusader knights, who's actually related in parts to the British royal family. Uh, they were ransacking their way through the Rhineland and just killing all these Jews. And, so anti Semitism ran deep. So let me get back to the World War I era. Is that King George essentially had a very cozy relationship with the Rothschild family, who were bankers, who, it even went back to the Napoleonic Wars with the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo, with the Rothschilds doing the war financing for that. Legend goes that they knew who won the battle even before the governments at that time knew. Uh, the Rothschilds were essentially just like, I hate to say this term, but the court Jews. They were the ones who were privy to the white power structure, essentially, and were able to do the financing for a lot of their projects and their warfare and whatnot. But the Brits had a very close relationship, more conducive, and I think a little more on par with what will become the concept that we know of Zionism. So the Rothschilds were bankers. I think the Rothschilds even helped to negotiate the Suez Canal deal. So that's a big deal. Also, after World War One, why is World War One important? Well, the Germans lost, and who were the German allies? The Ottoman Turks. Well, what did the Ottomans own? The Ottomans owned Palestine. So by beating Germany, by beating the Ottomans, the Brits get Palestine as a gift for the Rothschilds for their loyal service, making the British Empire one of the strongest empires financially, administrative wise ever to be on this planet. They were given Palestine, but it wasn't like they could just hand it over. It had to be a process of steps. So this is where kind of the meddling and the conspiracy aspects kind of come into play. Um, so King George, by basically beating uh, Kaiser Wilhelm, got Palestine, but also by effectively overthrowing the Tsar or whatnot, by what some people actually say is that the Bolsheviks were actually funded out of Wall Street. So you would say, like, why would Wall Street want to fund communists or whatever? Why wouldn't they? I mean, it's regime change. I mean, this is one of the earliest examples of it. It's just kind of like what does a totalitarian communist do? He or she takes over, nationalizes all of the resources, centralizes them, and then siphons the profits back. So, first off, this isn't an indictment of Marxism as an ideology, because that's another subject, but I'm just saying about this specific brand of communism, of totalitarian communism. It's essentially what it does is just loots. It just centralizes all the money and assets and centralizes that. So, essentially, by importing Marxism from the West. So importing it from the intellectual circles of Oxford and Cambridge, the British Royal Society and all that. Also from Wall Street financing, which was on its way up, which was controlled by the East Coast Anglo establishment, who have who probably consider themselves more British in their mentalities more so than American. So you have to think about the East Coast American establishment in the United Kingdom as just one and the same. You know, they're just the managers of the former colonies making all the money. Uh, so by overthrowing Russia and doing the Bolshevik Revolution or whatnot, which had a lot of Jewish support, but had a lot of Gentile support, had a lot of banking support, had a lot of British support, just to get them out the way. And then also Germany, get them out the way. What does that do? Britain is the number one sole superpower, and they can prep for when their overstretched empire has to eventually fade away. They can hand the keys over to the Americans, even though they all have investments back and forth between each other. So it's like they never really went away. They just kind of went into the shadows. They became a shadow banking empire. Um, so that's what I'm saying. So some Jews actually participated in some atrocities, and arguably, there's even I think there's even talks about. Let me see here. I'm not sure if I can share my screen with this particular camera, but the Rebbe in Germany, so like the rabbi, the chief rabbi, he gets taken out of Germany by Nazi commandos and somehow through, I think, what is his name? Henry Morgenthau. I think Henry Morgenthau and Brandeis University out of Boston, the Jewish college, they worked a deal somehow to get the Rebbe to come here to the United States, but the Nazis actually rescued him and delivered him to us. So there's something going on here. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's almost like a movie. It's like we need to set the stages for war for us to gain our power, but also we're going to help the Jews out here too. But unfortunately, some of them are going to have to go. And the ones who are going to have to go, sadly, were probably the more secular, everyday, average Joe Jews. Franz Kafka. Just the people on the street, the ones who were getting negative, who were getting hatred not only from anti-Semitism of Europeans, but also being shamed by their own people in the Orthodox radical sects who probably thought they weren't pure enough and they needed to be taught a lesson. And what was the greatest lesson? Well, if anti Semitism already exists, there's nothing we can do to stop it. How can we get people to go back and have this strong emotional attachment to Israel? How can we break essentially the assimilation of it all? Let's just let it work itself out. World War II is going to happen eventually, inevitably. I mean, all the war debts that Germany had because of the Brits and the Americans and the French and whatnot, that's going to spill over and let somebody like Hitler into power. And Hitler himself is, I'm not an expert on that, but, I don't want to drop things like Tavistock Institute or whatnot because I don't have that proof. You might have it. But Hitler had a very suspicious origins. And he had a lot of support within the British elite circles. Like everybody knows the Cliveden set with like Lady Astor. And who is Lady Astor related to? The Astor family. So I think the first multimillionaires in the United States who made their money off of fur trapping and then eventually got into real estate. And I actually think that they bought a farm on a small plot of Manhattan, which today I believe is either Wall Street or is the Empire State Building. That's heavy shit. I mean, that's heavy. That's power. So the Nazis had all of these ties to the British circle, like the Cliveden set. And this kind of bleeds into the Neville Chamberlain type of situation. Then you also interestingly had to support this fact that some Jewish people knew what was going to go down was that there was a princess named Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe of the Hohenlohe dynasty. So the Hohenlohe are of the Uradel, and the Uradel is basically like the old German nobility, like basically as the time of Charlemagne and Louis the German and East Francia, all that type of stuff. Like the families that can trace their roots back to that time are still alive, by the way. But the Hohenlohes were a part of that, and there's speculation that Stephanie actually was Jewish. And this actually isn't a strange thing. Many Jewish people actually married into white European nobility bloodlines. For example, actually the guy Prince Rupert, you can look him up. Type in Prince Rupert Rolling Stones. He's actually British nobility, and he's actually Jewish, and he's German nobility. But his let me go here. His bloodline, he's a subclass or house. I'm sorry, of the house of Wittelsbach. Wittelsbach, the Dukes of Bavaria. So that's heavy business, and they were also counts, the Palatine counts of the Rhine or whatnot. All the rich Rhine cities and whatnot. So there's Jewish bloodlines mixed in with many of these. So there's really no distinction. How we're taught is that, oh, it's Jew and Gentile, but really there's almost kind of like this other caste of people who are like European and Jewish, and you start to notice is that they're really the ones with the power at the end of the day. But like they kind of play this dialectics game of like Jew versus Gentile, and then they break down Gentiles into brackets of white, black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American to pit those groups against each other or whatnot. But it's really just these people at the top. And I call this group personally the ACZS Network. ACZS Network, which basically stands for the Anglo-Continental Zionist Network. Anglo for American Anglo, so pretty much England, the United States. Continental to denote continental Europe. So you have, this is where like the old, typically more Catholic power structure comes into play. The Zionists, who are highly Jewish, of course, but Zionism isn't explicitly Jewish, such as, for example, when it comes to the notion of British Israelism that kind of popped up in the early, mid to late 1800s, which is pretty much his idea that British people are the lost tribe of Israel or whatnot. So you had this mentality kind of mixing with the Jewish sort of Moshiach Zionist connection, and they kind of found commonality, which is arguably why I think that Britain and Israel and later the United States became so intertwined with each other. And then S for Saud, the Sauds, which is scary. I mean, because it's a pretty scary country. But the Sauds are essentially Israeli allies, and they were also propped up by the United States via, I think, was it John Paul Getty of Getty Oil, who was one of the first to actually drill in Saudi Arabia or convince them to drill there, and also Kuwait. So Getty Oil was a big player, just like the Rockefellers with Standard Oil. Um, so yeah, the Sauds were essentially elevated by the British, or whatnot, and by having that strong ally in the region, they were able to vouch for Israel, even though they had their disagreements, such as I think in the 1970s with the oil crisis or whatnot, when I think Saudi Arabia basically said, all this Israel stuff, like, nah, like, we got power too, so we're basically just gonna stop drilling, and you're gonna be waiting in gas lines forever until we get what we want. And I think because of that really is one of the reasons why like the Bush family and all that really started taking oil countries a lot more seriously, because such a vital region. But we all know that, so I won't get there. But back to this, it's uncomfortable, but I call it the ACZS Network. Some Jews actually knew what was going down. And why would they do that? Well, because we're talking about religion here. We're not talking about us and our secular, skeptical world. We're talking about true believers here, people who believe that they are the chosen people of God and that their Messiah will come back to earth. And this is the Jews. But you also have the Christians who believe that, the Antichrist will come, Armageddon will happen, Jesus will defeat the Antichrist, the Jews will convert to Christianity. So you have these two religions that need each other but don't agree with each other. And that in its way has kind of developed into this culture within the United States, particularly with evangelical Christianity, which in my opinion has a very strange psychology to it, because it goes back to what I was talking about with the Crusades. You have these sort of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Teutonic knight type figures who are very anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitism unfortunately does have, a very strong history within white society. Because there's just this petty competition between them or something. But, in America, you have this sort of, what I like to joke about, this sort of Joe Rogan type of American sniper, good old boy, George Bush type, stars and bars. I'll drive a big truck. I like my girls in Daisy Dukes and short shorts. Don't take my guns type of thing. But everybody's an evangelical Christian, you know, and Israel has to be protected at all costs and everything, but you have this anti-Semitic sort of like underlying thing to it. So it's like it's very confusing, but it makes sense. It's a symbiotic relationship that kind of evolved into this kind of culture, which you can really witness within the Bible Belt or like megachurch culture and stuff like that, which has always been kind of a proxy of just political power. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's easy to start. It's kind of hard. It's easy to start a war when you're able to link religion in with it. Like for example, after 9/11, Muslims got thrown under the bus. Most Americans had no clue about Islam at all. I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Christian. I was baptized and whatnot, snipped, all that. But like Muslims got thrown under the bus, and the people who planned that war knew that was going to happen because they knew dialectics. They knew that people are afraid of one another that they when they don't understand them or whatnot. They know that religion controls the mind. I'm not trying to throw some atheism out there, but it's like what Russ Cole said in True Detective: it's a virus of the mind. Or it's a cure for the mind, depending on who you are. But something went down. So some stuff went on here. And for example, I'm going to show you some photos. Not sure if you can see all that right there. These people have Jewish blood. Jewish blood. Quarter Jew, half Jew. So you're telling me, so that's what I'm saying is that British intelligence, the up and coming American intelligence, all that Skull and Bones, which led her to become the OSS, like the movie The Good Shepherd with Matt Damon. All of this stuff was going on. And I literally think that they constructed Nazism. They constructed communism. But why would they do that? Like that's so radical. That's so crazy. It all seems organic. Even even Nazis who might be watching this video, oh, it can't be true. It can't be true. I'm sorry. They created you. They want you to act the way you're acting because it all feeds into the ultimate agenda. It all feeds into the ultimate agenda. It doesn't matter whether you're a social justice warrior, some alt-right kid with frog memes, or whatever. It don't mean anything. You're exactly where they want you to be, and you're acting the exact way how they knew you were going to react. Because the human mind in psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, uh, Geert Hofstede's cultural dimensions, Michael Porter's, factors of competition, all these things you would learn in management, strategy, Machiavelli, the Prince, it doesn't matter. They know that you're exactly where they want you to be. Unfortunately and sadly, until you wake up. And like I said, I think they really created the Nazis. They created the Bolsheviks. They funded the Bolsheviks because where was Marx from? Marx was a German. But ultimately, everybody talks about Marxism. It's kind of funny how we don't call it Engelism or or Engeletics or something, because Engels was a rich kid from, I think, Stratford or Stafford or something in Birmingham, in Birmingham. I'm sorry, the Manchester area in the late 1800s was very industrial. He was the rich kid of an industrialist family, and he helps write the Communist Manifesto. You know what I'm saying? Why? Why? Because, like I said, communism in the totalitarian sense centralizes assets, and who benefits from that? The elite, the rich. You know, um, and that's what I truly believe. I mean, that's why I'm kind of speculating. And how does that link to JD Salinger? Well, so like I said, World War One, King George, Tsar, the Kaiser Czar, nixed, Germany exposed, in debt, can't pay back, hyperinflation, anti-Semitism, which is basically almost natural in its culture, dating back to, like I said, the Crusades and all this type of stuff. It was going to happen. They fed into it. They let the worst parts of themselves get the best of them. Is what happened to the German people. And I lived in Germany. I love Germany. I love the German culture. Like when it comes to medieval German stuff, don't even start here. I love that. Germany was taken off. The Kaiser's gone. Now the Bolsheviks, where did they get their funding from? Where did they get their arms from? They got it from Wall Street banking houses and clearing houses and all that type of stuff. I mean, it wasn't that hard, Buy some guns here, ship them over here, train over there, donkey them over there. Next thing you know, they got guns. And And Hitler, though, was so interesting about him is that he truly thought that he was going to win something. Like he thought he was going to win. There was no way Germany could have won that. I mean, it's surrounded. The fact that it's in the central location, in my opinion, culturally makes it more predisposed to expanding outwards naturally. Just like like if any people were in a central location surrounded by others, they would have more of a defensive mentality, just almost kind of in their consciousness. So they would always constantly be thinking about expanding out Lebensraum. A lot of this is dated back to the times of Henry the Lion in the Middle Ages, this German notion of expansion outwards, just because of their location by proxy. So Hitler actually thought that he was going to pull this off because he had connections with the British royal family. What was it, like Prince King Edward or whatever, who abdicated or whatnot? He supported Nazism. And the thing about this era was that there was three political ideologies that were being beta tested to see what was going to go on. And this is where philosophy comes in, modernism to postmodernism, all this type of stuff. So the modernist ideas of democracy were the liberal democracy, like where we have the United States, capitalism, federalism, separation of powers, freedoms. You had communism, the state controls everything on the auspices, technically, that the state would erode away and you have some utopian paradise. And then you have fascism. And fascism is basically almost just kind of like a new age feudalism, corporatism kind of sort of a thing. Like it's pretty like you just think of it as royal houses, but the royal houses are just businesses, and the knights are just like security forces or brown shirts or thugs who just enforce the will or whatnot. But you have this culture of all the people are one and working together. So it's kind of a third way kind of a thing between the state apparatus that you would consider with like communism, but also mixed with kind of like the profiteering and quasi personal ownership of like a liberal democracy kind of fused into one. But the thing about fascism is that fascism can be multicultural. Like in Brazil, you had the integralist movement, which was had whites, blacks, Hispanics, everybody. But the thing about the fascism that we know is that it is typically racialist, unfortunately, in its nature. So it's in all of these experiments, you almost have to think is that it sounds very Aldous Huxley. It sounds very Brave New World. It's like it was in a think of World War I and World War II as let's rename them the wars of the democratic experiments. It's kind of what it was. They were the first wars of democracies. Who was going to win? Was the liberal democracy going to win? Was communism going to win? Was fascism going to win? And the liberal democracy ultimately came out on top. But what's interesting is that the liberal democracy is probably the one who started it to begin with by, doing these draconian war debts on the German people, knowing that it was going to activate anti-Semitism. And many Jewish leaders knew that that was going to happen, and they probably wanted it to happen because the Brits had just won Palestine. They had just won, the Holy Land back. How are they going to get these people who are assimilated and intermarried with Germans and Poles and Hungarians or whatnot who felt more like Hungarian or German than Jewish? How are they going to get these people to unplug and go back to the Holy Land? A traumatic experience. And it's sad. It is very sad. It's very controversial. But the sad truth is that some Jewish people knew what was going on. Just like British intelligence probably helped to instigate it. And American intelligence helped instigate it. Jewish intelligence helped instigate it with the whole, Rebbe system and all that. Chabad Lubavitch, all these type of groups. And this is what I'm saying. This is the proto basis of the ACZS network. And even to this day, as we're seeing with Jeffrey Epstein, with his connection with Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew, who's he connected to? Princess Diana. Who did she die with? Dodi Fayed. Who is Dodi Fayed related to? Adnan Khashoggi. Who's Adnan Khashoggi to? Oh, Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who just got hacked up by the Saudis. All these connections, all in your face, all there. All you have to, you don't even have to speculate. Just write a list, and it's all there. And yeah, it's just wild, man. It's wild. And I don't want to make this too long, but here's another book. It is called The Collaboration: Hollywood's Pact with Hitler. So this is what I'm saying. Things that went down before World War II were kind of fishy, man. They were kind of fishy. Was Hitler a bad dude? Absolutely a bad dude. Was he anti-Semitic and racist? Absolutely. Did he think he was going to win? Yeah, he thought he was going to win. He went insane. But this is what I think what happened was that the British, after they won World War One, they were looking for how can we continue. How we have to reach the finish line of this. We have to cut Europe in half. We have to create a new order. Essentially, we have to get to the new paradigm. We have to elevate ourselves upwards, the world. You know, Darwinism, evolution. How do we evolve? Um, they found their guy in a lonely, failed artist from Germany living in Vienna around the same times of other prolific leaders like Tito and Stalin and Freud. They found this guy. And the next thing you know, he's a rabble rouser in beer halls in Bavaria, the southern part of Germany, the more Catholic conservative part, raising Cain, talking about the West and the Jews and how we have to control our money and all this type of stuff and make Germany great again type stuff. But he was almost an asset. He had ties to the Brits and whatnot. He probably had ties to the Americans, and a lot of the networking was happening through areas like Switzerland as a neutral country because that's where all the money is. Frank Wisner, I believe, actually had his offices in Switzerland during the war when he was doing his intel uh, gathering for the OSS. But anyways, Hitler but this is what Hitler probably thought they were on his side and things were going to work in his favor, but it was a trap. Sorry, Hitler, you did your part. Now it's on you. You're the monster. Like we didn't tell you to kill Jews. I mean, we kind of assumed you would, but we didn't tell you to. We didn't tell you to, and you did it. So now it's on you. And guess what? The Soviets, who we don't like, we actually like them a little bit better than you, because they actually feed into our plans going into the future of this thing that we call the Cold War, which was potentially all just about controlling energy prices and dividing the world in half just to begin with, so that it was more manageable after the post-war. And also, this kind of might relate even to Operation Paperclip. Not only do you cut the world in half, but also you can control oil prices, because what happened right after World War II, all the oil shit started going down. Iran, all that type of stuff. But it was also a way to control the populations of the earth. Why was communism always implemented in developing countries that had population problems, like India, China? Control the population, starve the people away. But also, what did it do? It also created a sort of friendly, behind the scenes competition for technological innovation. The Soviets were very smart. I mean, they innovated a lot. We took some of their ideas in America. The Americans were super smart. They took some of our ideas. And what you have is a competition in a Darwinist sense of apex predators fighting for control, evolving themselves. And that technology would eventually create the groundwork of what we have now of GPS, satellites, laying down the ground roots of technocracy, automation, everything we're seeing now. And think about Epstein. What was he into? MIT, science seminars on his island, Bill Gates, all this type of stuff. Bitcoin. He invited that accused rapist, that former Disney child star Brock Pierce, to his island to talk about Bitcoin. Steve Bannon's also connected to the Brock Pierce through his Goldman Sachs ties with his crazy as it sounds World of Warcraft money mining racket that he tried to run out of Hong Kong. Goes deep, but this is crazy because this book by Bryan Irwand, who is a junior fellow of the Society of Fellows at Harvard University. So this is not some right-wing conspiracy book or anything like that. This is legitimate how Hollywood actually played a role in elevating and helping Hitler. And who was controlling Hollywood at that time? Various people. You had, different groups. You had white, just Anglo-Saxon people running it. You also had Jews. Louis Meyer, Russian Jew in America, MGM Studios. And what does he do after World War II? He becomes a hardcore Republican. Why would he become a Republican? Because the neoconservative movement was rising. And the neoconservative movement actually is noted actually by Jewish sources as actually having roots in in Zionism and Judaism. Just like it was a mix of Judaism with the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment to pretty much create this apparatus of the John Birch Society, the deep state, what I'm talking about, CIA, Iran Contra later on, all of these right wing, quote unquote, G.I. Joe paramilitary groups ran by people like John K. Singlaub or whatnot, running drugs to help create money and slush funds to fund revolutions across the world. This is some deep stuff. And Hollywood played a role in that because Hollywood is the propaganda machine. And it also, its location in Southern California is very strategic. Not only is California the entertainment complex, you also have the aerospace industry. Where did a lot of those Operation Paperclip people go? They went to Southern California. It wasn't just Cape Canaveral or the Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. They went to Southern California because who's in Southern California? You have Howard Hughes. You have Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, aerospace industries, Vandenberg Air Force Base. So you have a mix in Southern California between Hollywood propaganda, the Rand Corporation, technocratic state, and all these military contractors. But you also have a darker side, which kind of bleeds a little bit more into conspiracy theory of the occultic elements of it. And the occultic elements actually, let's just say in a more PC term, counterculture. Counterculture, occult, Neoplatonism, all that type of stuff is all kind of connected to each other. And there was a lot of weird stuff going down in Southern California in the early 1900s. So think about the movie LA Confidential, all those sex rackets and rings and, people dressing up like child stars and stuff for like rich men and stuff like that. That stuff was going down. And interestingly, famous people like Jack Parsons, who has a TV show on CBS Access now, Strange Angel, a good show. Goes into details about the occultic kind of sex magic elements of Southern California. And the thing about Jack Parsons is, I'm trying to connect a lot here because I'm trying to cram a lot here actually. Jack Parsons was a part of Aleister Crowley's sex magic kind of cult, basically. So sex magic and everything like that, orgies, all that. The thing about Jack Parsons was he was also affiliated with Robert Heinlein through the La Manana Literary Society based out of Santa Monica or in the Santa Monica kind of mountains area. So Robert Heinlein, if you don't know him, is the author of Starship Troopers. What is Starship Troopers about? Starship Troopers, the mythos in the book, I think it was written in 1951 or 1959, talks about how the Russian Anglo-American establishment fights the Chinese hegemony. What are we seeing right now under Donald Trump? All of this anti-China stuff, the Wuhan labs, the tariffs, the Hong Kong protests, even though we might know that the Hong Kong protests might have been probably instigated by a certain intelligence agency. All of this stuff going on. And Robert Heinlein in that book talks about a Russian American Anglo establishment. Come on, really? He wrote that in 1959. What's happening under Donald Trump? Oh, Russia's fine. Russia's good. Putin's fine. Let him into the club for once and for all. You have all of these alt-right type of groups being infiltrated by like Russian Orthodox people. I think there was a teacher in Florida who got busted for having a Russian alias with like the Russian Orthodox cross, promoting far right ideology. So they're trying to kind of in a multi-dimensional way, multifaceted way, try to include Russia more into the pathos of the West, particularly by playing on racial fears that the white person has, particularly the white male, because they feel beat up now, because they're under the radar with white privilege and all these type of things. They're needing somebody, and then all of a sudden, subliminally, these intelligence groups, these YouTube agents, and all these people are out here kind of grooming them to push them more towards Russia. Oh, Putin's fine, man. Ethno-nationalism, all this type of stuff. Monarchism. You have people actually wanting monarchism now. Crazy. Why? Just because there's a YouTube, or just because there's a Netflix show called Dear White People, it hurts your feelings that bad? Have you not realized the sheer amount of violence and racism that this country has produced? And if anything, like, I don't hate white people at all. I grew up around white people. But I feel that this is actually a sign of weakness. And I think you should really check yourself on that. Like, for real. Like, don't be weak. Like, if you need a daddy or something, this is why Jordan B. Peterson got popular, because he knew that there was a base of people sitting around playing video games, the post Eminem type crowd, who wanted to do the Roman salute, the Spartan haircut, and feel like a man again, or for the first time ever. So there was an opportunity there. You got used as an opportunity in a larger war that's going on for the hearts and the minds of the people, in a psychological operation that's actually probably connected to a lot of this stuff. And they want you exactly where it is, where you are, and they want you acting the way you are. So I'm trying to actually give you advice here. So yeah, like, it's going down. But as a summary, I have a timeline that I'm gonna go and read to you, and to put this into perspective, particularly how JD Salinger was a periphery character. He was not like a conspiracy mind control guy or nothing like that, but he was a periphery character with the CIC, and the CIC was connected to Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, knew that a lot of these Nazis were coming to the United States, but also some of these Nazis, like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, was in South America, helping to set up the cocaine cartels, which would later have a detrimental effect on the United States in the 1980s with the crack epidemic, which will later be exposed in Iran-Contra situation. The Iran-Contra situation was actually investigated by, guess who? Henry Morgenthal's son. So FDR's Secretary of Treasury's son was a judge in the Southern District of New York, one of the most famous districts always in the news. He oversaw the investigation of the BCCI Bank, which was pretty much a shell bank with CIA connections, which helped to funnel the money to the Iranians during the Iran-Contra situation. But was also a drug bank as well, because that's why Iran-Contra was. The Nicaraguans with the cocaine gets sold, the money gets confiscated, or the profits get stored in slush funds. The slush funds helps to buy arms. The arms get brokered between Saudis and Israelis, and the next thing you know, it's in Iran. And the next thing you know, U.S. hostages get brought back, and Ronald Reagan's a hero. This is the crazy shit that was going down. And but the thing about JD Salinger is like, I feel bad for the guy, but he does illuminate a lot. It's like a person who's not in the cabal, but who illuminates a lot about the cabal, is the way you have to really think about him. And when I was talking about Frank Wisner of the CIA, with it, excuse me, with his plans of bringing in white Russian defectors into the United States, the thing about him is, one of those white Russians I predict, or I assume, was actually no other than Vladimir Nabokov of Lolita. Lolita. What does that even insinuate? Old men, young women, Jeffrey Epstein. We have a central character who's a shadowy figure who stumbles upon this house of this widow who's kind of into him, but he falls for the daughter. The mother ends up passing away. The daughter and everything, and him have a sexual rendezvous romance, basically pedophilia. So we're talking about this, and this is an example that links back to um, my white noise kind of analysis, which I'll have to finish here soon. Talking about the transition from modernism to postmodernism via decayed modernism. So Nabokov, Gaddis are examples of the transition period of modernism to postmodernism. What I was talking about in my white noise video of think about modernism as a solid circle, truth, objective truth, scientism, cracking. Why did it crack? The Holocaust, the A-bomb, the fact that humans are insane, the fact that there is no truth. That movement led to postmodernism, essentially. And books like this, kind of with its kind of more digressive elements, or kind of like from a literary artistic standpoint, an example of modernism transitioning to what will later become postmodernism, as exemplified by people like Thomas Pynchon, Gaddis, Don DeLillo, later writers like Bret Easton Ellis of American Psycho, Chuck Palahniuk or whatever his name is of Fight Club, more of your digressive, hardcore, in your face, there is no truth, anarchistic sort of fiction. So I really do think that he was a CIA sort of person. That he was essentially just invited over with some of the agendas that Frank Wisner, who later committed suicide, wanted. Um, so Lolita is about that. And Lolita, interestingly, by Nabokov, he taught at Cornell University. And who was one of his students? Thomas Pynchon, the famous postmodernist author who I think he won the Pulitzer Prize for Gravity's Rainbow. He was one of his students, and he worked for Boeing before leaving Boeing. He later became a hippie and wrote some of the most prolific postmodernist texts ever. And the thing about it is what did even Thomas know? You know what I'm saying? He's working for Boeing. His professor is potentially a CIA immigrant working at Cornell University, writing about pedophilia. And the next thing you know, Thomas Pynchon just goes off the hook and writes all this postmodernist fiction, particularly Gravity's Rainbow, which relates to what? Operation Paperclip. So it's all connected. It's like it's all there in your face. You just have to get rid of the identity for a while and just try to look for the truth. Other books I have here, Catcher in the Rye, beautiful book. This is a beautiful book. And this is why people think that JD Salinger was like some MK Ultra mind control thing. Even though MK Ultra was real, but it's my truth is that this book was so powerful from like let's just say a spiritual or existential sense. There was nothing else like it, that it caused a revolution in the youth. It was about angst, existentialism. I think it kind of reminds me of the notion of Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werner. And it is my belief that that had a social phenomenon in Germany in the Romantic period, the Hegelian Romantic Wagner period in Germany of like the 1800s of a suicide, like a suicide, copycat suicides. Young men were committing suicide after supposedly reading that book because it was about like a young man who gets his heart broken, the girl he loves leaves him for an older guy, and it has such an impact that supposedly it's debatable. It's maybe almost like an urban legend that young men were killing themselves. And this book kind of reminds me of that. Is that it was so impactful, the kind of rebel without a cause, post-war, you know, type of thing. That it inspired a few people by incident who felt that they had a friend. You know, crazy people are looking for people to look up to, and they found a friend in Salinger because, you know, Holden Caulfield's character is essentially, I mean, he's mentally ill. in, or rather, maybe he's just the most honest person you ever knew. He's going around talking arguably about violence. I mean, he has antisocial tendencies. He's very introspective, withdrawn. There's even a scene in the book where his psychiatrist actually makes a move on him. His male psychiatrist makes a move on young Holden. Just another example of that. People are phonies. People are liars. So we have a psychiatrist trying to make a move on a young boy, written by a guy who was in the CIC, with the CIC having connections to the OSS, such as Henry Kissinger, State Department, Nazis, drug running, stay behind units. I mean, it reveals a lot. Sex honeypot traps, Hollywood, connecting back to Lolita, Nabokov being imported over here to teach at Cornell. One of his students is Thomas Pynchon. Thomas Pynchon writes about the V2 rocket program in Gravity's Rainbow. We already talked about JD Salinger and the Nazis. Hitler's Jewish soldiers. What went down before World War II? Did some of the Jewish people know? Some of the more radical Zionist religious people, they probably thought that maybe some of our own people got to go in order to bring forth the Moshiach. And we can get away with it because anti-Semitism is such a real thing, it's such a strong thing, that who's going to believe that a conspiracy ever happened? They're just going to say that, oh, it just happened. It was just organic, White people are just racist. It just happened. We also have 9 Stories by JD Salinger. Some very powerful stories in here that talks about the human condition. And some other books I'm going to kind of go talk about. The Russian Cosmist. Now this is more towards the MK Ultra standpoint, but it also links to what I'm talking about with technocracy. Why? For example, when I first heard about Jack Parsons, I read about him, and I knew that he had correspondence with Wernher von Braun of the V2 rocket program, Operation Paperclip. But one thing you don't really hear about is that he also had contact with Russian scientists, such as Stielslavsky. So he was inspired by Wernher von Braun, Stielslavsky. So we have this rocket scientist who pretty much helped to create the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is very close with NASA, which is very close to Howard Hughes and all of the military-industrial complex in Hollywood and all the neocons and John Birch Society and the Hunt family and JFK. It goes deep. But the Russian cosmos aspect of it is never talked about, because I think that in our Russia type environment that we live in, is that people, just because that Russiagate failed, which was an intentional failure by the state because they were in on it too, in my personal belief. A lot of people just think that, oh, Russia's just harmless, like whatever, man. Like, why can't they be our friends? I want Russia to be our friends. I have nothing against the Russian people at all. But at the same time, let's not get it twisted here that like there are agendas going on from that country trying to like infiltrate and infect our country or whatnot. Let's not just like, just because you might have, you might be a Russian person yourself. I think Matt Taibbi of the Rolling Stones is Russian. Good for him. There's nothing wrong with that. But he has this kind of thing where it's like, nah, it's not Russia, man. Like I promise you, not. It's totally fabricated. That's because you want to believe that. Like, yes, we want peace with Russia, but there's some crazy shit that went down with some Russian stuff, man. Like, this book here talks about Russian cosmos, and this is from the Oxford Press, and this is by George Michael Young of the University of New England. I highly recommend this book. I recommend this book more than the MIT version of the Russian cosmos. And it goes, I don't even know where to begin, but I'm going to do some other videos just to kind of point it out to you. But it talks about technocracy. It talks about like artificial intelligence. It talks about merging man with machine and everything like that. Like Joe Rogan, I want to be an android. I want to live 1,000 years. All this type of stuff is connected. Why is it connected? What is the underlying philosophy behind technocracy and globalism, and all these and all this sort of political drama in between to make it happen in dialectics is evolution, is Darwinism. That's how they see it. That's how people in power see themselves. They see themselves as the apex predator. They see themselves as entitled to evolve the species, basically, or to save the species. Some of those intentions might be good. Some of them are not very good at all. And and I'm not going to plagiarize or anything, but I have to give some credence to some shout outs to Jay Dyer. Actually, even though I don't agree with Jay on a lot of stuff, man, because he's on this Russia type orthodox binge, and it's hard to trust him 100%, even though his videos are some of the most enlightening things you probably can watch. But I would recommend more of the historical analysis type things. Like, I'm not trying to get into his theology type stuff. Some of his videos can, for such a smart guy, can seem very childish and clownish, to the point where it's just like you're contributing to the fact of like shaming like conspiracy or investigative journalists or something. But a lot of his videos are very profound, and one of his things about it is he traces Darwinist evolution back to occultism. And you would say, how is that even possible? Science and magic. Well, in theory, if I remember right, well, Neoplatonism of Plotinus, who was a philosopher kind of in the early Roman period, not to be confused with Plato, actually tried to expand upon Plato's more esoteric philosophy. And Plotinus created almost kind of like the rubric of what you would consider to be modern day magic, Western magic, the occult, Kabbalah, even. Because the Jews were in Rome, Italy, all that type of stuff, learning, picking up ideas. Satanism, even witchcraft. A lot of these things have a Platonic element to it, and the crossover between this sort of more spiritual, occultic idea with science is the concept of alchemy. And alchemy was pretty much as an early attempt at science, like for example, turning base metals into gold. I'm trying to turn copper into gold. Many people attempted that in the Middle Ages. That was almost kind of like magical science. So that's where it kind of comes from. Like, for example, in Neoplatonism, that went to influence Hermeticism. That went to influence Christian Kabbalah. That arguably went to influence Masonry, the Illuminati, which was a real thing, by the way. Martinism, which was kind of an offset of the Illuminati. After the Illuminati, I believe, in Bavaria was persecuted, they went over to France and started the Order of the Martinists, who actually went over to Russia. So there's actually a lot of kind of more occultic elements to things going on, but you have to be very sensitive when you talk about that, because then people start thinking, oh, you're just going down that rabbit hole. But what you're honestly, all that you're doing is just kind of explaining like the philosophical evolution of how things came to be. It started with kind of the more mystical elements of Plato, then later the Plotinus sort of school of thought that branched out into Kabbalah, Hermeticism, mysticism, and whatnot, alchemy. But then from alchemy, you kind of get science. I mean, in a way, like for example, like the Platonic view is that the universe is kind of comprised of like the one. There is one true source to everything, and that is perfection. But there's different levels of the one. And we, in our physical realm, some people consider it the evil realm, the material realm, is one of like the lower levels. So essentially, by practicing like alchemy or sort of ritualistic magic, for example, we can actually go back and transcend back to the one, or even contact or communicate with the one. So this is the monad, the one. But there's also certain traditions under Neoplatonism, if I'm understanding it correctly, that you have the dyad. So yin yang, think about it like that. So you have a good force, but then you have a demiurge. A demiurge is like think of it as like a demigod, something that is subservient to the one, which is actually what we would consider in the Neoplatonic sense to be God. So God to some Neoplatonists is actually evil, is actually an evil thing. But the real God is behind this evil God, which kind of oversees the material realm. And this is kind of the framework of not what I believe, but I'm saying this is kind of what like kind of more of your classical medievalist, alchemist, Neoplatonist thought. And what's funny is that when it comes to democracy, so this kind of links back to what I'm talking about as far as like um, the liberal democracy, fascism, communism, these experiments, these ideas, which are all democratic experiments. This actually traces back to the Renaissance through a person named I think it's Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, um, which is of the Mirandola family, which was a Italian noble family from like the northern region of kind of like the Lombardy area, which is actually very interesting. Side note is that the Mirandola family actually intermarried with the d'Este family, and the d'Este family actually married into the Borgia family, and the Borgias were the Catholic popes, some of the most infamous Catholic popes, like the was it the Feast of the Whores, where the Pope actually uh, conducted an orgy basically, and whoever could bang the most whores would get a prize. Like so crazy shit was going down during those times, but Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, he helped to pretty much create one of the first treaties on democracy. And he was actually a practitioner of Hermeticism and the occult and all this type of stuff, magic. He was practicing magic and conjuring spells, which was at that time, you can almost say, kind of a noble intention. It wasn't really him trying to be like a Satanist or anything. He was just seeing that the Catholic Church and the church was having this very sort of restrictive type of hold on innovation. So he came back and pretty much just said, "I'm going to write this treatise and of the democratic rights of man, of the rights of the divine man, democratic man, or whatever, to pretty much liberate humanity." And this is interesting because democracy has an occultic element to it. It has what I'm talking about right now. And interestingly, Giovanni was in Italy, and what was happening in Italy during this time of the Borgias and the Medici, banking was happening. Banks, banco, Italian for bench, because people would conduct business on park benches. And the thing about it is, so you have banking on the rise, and you have democracy on the rise. But democracy at that time was more of like kind of like a, think of it as almost like almost like a skull and bones type of thing. It was almost kind of very mystical. It was very like we're talking about liberation, freedom, early libertarians, early Marxists. These all trace roots back to this sort of democratic, sort of occultic idea and experiments that were going on in Italy between Jewish thinkers, Christian thinkers, and even Islamic thinkers, because you have to remember is that there were Muslims in Italy at that time, particularly under the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the Holy Roman Emperors, Italy, Sicily, all that. So you had a lot of ideas being exchanged between each other. I think the Islamic people were called the Averronists, or whatnot, and so you have banking on the rise, and then you have democracy on the rise. And democracy will later find a home in these orders like the Illuminati, the Masons. What were the Masons known for? They were known for, in civil engineering, basically. They had all the tricks of the trade when it came to like, sanding stones, building castles, all this type of stuff. But there was also kind of a religious element you can also think with Masons, is that they're the temple builders. And the temple builders of what temple? The temple of the Holy Land, particularly some of these things that the Jews want to rebuild, like Solomon's temple, I believe, which has been burned down or destroyed multiple times, and they're trying to rebuild it again in the current day. So that's like another link between like the West and the Jewish type thing. So through all of these Masonic type of houses, and through banking financing, you start getting democratic revolutions. And why would you get democratic revolutions? Well, because they were trying to get rid of the monarchy, because the monarchy were the ones who were taxing, toll taxes, river taxes, all these type of taxes and all of these regulations, and they were taking all of the money. So all these guilds and all these masons were like, hey, wait, hold up, like there's all these new ideas like capitalism coming around. I can be rich. I can be richer than you. Just because you inherited your money doesn't mean you have the right to take my money. And what do you start sounding like? You start sounding like an American. You start sounding like a democratic person. And this is where these revolutions start happening. And I learned this from Jay Dyer. And like I said, I don't 100% agree with him on a lot of stuff, I think, but I won't go there. But, he's a smart dude. He's a smart guy. I give him kudos for a lot of the stuff he knows. The French Revolution, for example, was, we think about, Robespierre, the Reign of Terror. But there was this group called, the Jacobins, the Jacobin movement, right? And the Jacobin movement were almost kind of like, like a radical sect of the people, the peasants basically leading the revolt against the ancient regime. And the ancient regime were no good people, by the way. Like the ancient regime also had people like the Marquis de Sade, people who just had the power to just rape farm girls, whenever they wanted to, kidnap people, use them as sex slaves. Like this was the mentality of the nobility at that time. They could do whatever they wanted to, and there was nothing you can do. And the papacy sat back and let it happen because they were probably in on it too. The peasants got fed up. But the Jacobin movement was actually very closely associated with Masonic lodges. So you have these Masonic lodges or beer halls or people hanging out talking about ideas, and they start a revolution. And the Jacobins were actually, from what I understand of them, it's kind of like a blanket term, and we kind of use it in a derogatory sense nowadays to talk about somebody who's radical, and it's typically more aligned with kind of Marxism. So, for example, the publication, the Jacobin, is more of a left wing Marxist type of analysis editorial. But Jacobins had different sects, and it's my understanding is that it wasn't what is it Girondins who were a sect, and then Jacobins who were a sect. It was Jacobins as the umbrella, but you had like the Pikes, the Montagnards, the Girondins. You had a bunch of different sort of caucuses of people who had this idea of what democracy will look like. But the prevailing idea in France, actually, which is a democracy, by the way, who helped fund the Americans in our democracy, was so much more about the proletariat and the class and the peasantry that it sort of evolved into what we would consider to be social democracy and Marxism. That's why France is a lot more centralized than the United States is, because the United States, under our Masonic lodges, through like the Anglo lodges, Scottish Rite, Yorkish Rite, which was in the United States as well. Everybody knows that the presidents, a lot of them were Masons. That kind of aligned with the Girondin school of thought. And the Girondins kind of had more of the libertarian thought of private property. So, all the freedom you want, do what you want, love who you want, screw who you want, smoke what you want, but just don't fuck with my property. Don't, I have God-given rights by the divine creator, the all-seeing eye, who tells me that I'm allowed to have an AK-47 and a weed plant and some cocaine, and I'm allowed to, you know, love whoever I want. But the thing about the Girondin model, which kind of more aligns to liberal democracy, not to be confused with us, the social democracy more Marxist, liberal democracy more capitalist or libertarian, depending how far you go. It created, the thing about liberal democracy is it did what? It created corporatism. It evolved ultimately into its own totalitarian state, just like the Marxists ultimately evolved into their own totalitarian state. So you had basically, you can almost say the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was basically just like state-controlled production versus large mega corporation corrupt production is all it was. And like interestingly, one of the reasons why the United States is so powerful is because we're not some capitalist democracy and everything. No, we're a pragmatic democracy. That is the only form of philosophy that the United States is known for. We're known for pragmatism. Pragmatism is the only thing we've contributed to philosophy wise, and that in advertising. Um, and what is pragmatism? Pragmatism, simply put, is just taking what works from everything and smashing it into a smoothie and drinking it. That's all pragmatism is. So, like, for example, after World War II, right? What do? We took Nazis, we took Soviets, and we implemented them into our liberal democracy apparatus, and it evolved into what? Third way. That's why we're a third way country. Even Bill Clinton was like, we're third way. Like, we're not some free market economy, and we're not a totalitarian state. We mix both of them, and we pragmatically align certain components to work into our favor in order to support our power structure. Is kind of what it is, kind of what it sounds like. And the interesting thing is that if you Google fascist symbol Congress, what's going to pop up? A fascist, the fascies, the stick with the axe in between. The United States arguably is a fascist country, but is glossed over with this concept of Americanism and Americana and white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, mixed with the melting pot and exceptionalism and diversity. But the logos, the operating program of it is actually a third way fascist corporatist state dominated by a 1%, in which the 1% can basically print money to subsidize their own businesses while charging everybody else inflation, which is a tax, is what it is. And this isn't black people in power doing this. So when everybody always wants to blame, oh, black people, this or that, we're not doing this. We're, I don't know how many black people are in the Illuminati. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's so interesting that, like, a group like QAnon and all these groups will just pop out of nowhere, but they're never gonna blame who's really to blame. You know what I'm saying? They're just gonna they're looking at it, but they're just gonna be like, well, oh, well, it was just the child molester and this or that, but they're not gonna actually say that no, it's actually all these rich, entitled, nepotistic people of what I consider to be the Anglo-Continental Zionist Thought Network actually running things, and a lot of them probably look like you, and they've always had power, and they want you to feel like you have power over other people. They want to promote you to be racist because that's how the caste system works, is making the peasantry feel like they're kings, and by diverting all their hatred on other people by calling out their differences, just so you stay in your place, middle class bourgeoisie. They want you to be stars and bars, neo-Nazi and shit like that, because you help them police the people who are actually on your side, so you never connect with each other and actually start calling out actual power for what it is. And I rest my case. So, so it's just kind of like, but this is some crazy shit too. The Beast Reawakens. This talks about Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny was a hitman for Mossad, killing. He helped to kill. So some of the Nazis didn't go to the United States. Some of them just went on their own, and they gave their services to some Arabian countries like Egypt. And Egypt had a problem with Israel. That was very young at the time. This is where, like, the 6 Day War, the Yom Kippur War, all this type of stuff happens. We beat back the Egyptians. We were attacked from all sides. Yeah, they were. And what's interesting is that some of those Nazi scientists went to Egypt to help to create their nuclear program. So Egypt was almost a nuclear power in the region, and the West was not going to have that, even though we did like Nasser. And we also knew that the Suez Canal was very vital to our interests. But they weren't going to get any damn nuclear weapons, and Nazis were helping him get those. So Mossad picked up on it, and they found Otto Skorzeny living in Spain, I think Majorca, with his wife, and they pretty much said that we're going to turn you over to, was it Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, if you don't take out these people for us. And Otto Skorzeny, who was a hardcore Nazi his whole life and even supported neo-Nazi movements, had a Nazi funeral, actually said, yeah, I'll kill these people for you, but you're going to take me off that list. Deal's a deal. And he ended up killing those Nazi scientists or whatnot. But like, that's what I'm saying, is that just because they're Jewish or Nazi or whatnot, first off, doesn't mean that they weren't allies at a certain point, or they saw each other as essential dialectics in fulfilling each other's cause. I mean, without World War II, we wouldn't have Israel. But if Israel is so important and it had to come, the justification is that we need a war to create Israel. You know what I'm saying? Like, they needed the war to happen. Just like a Nazi needs a Jew to exist, and a Jew needs a Nazi to exist. You know, for the dialectics and everything like that. But as I said, if you go back to this book, it paints a different story. Are they all one? Are they all the same? At the upper echelons of power? Yeah, probably. So I know it's talking about the Russian cosmos. This is actually a very good book. This actually relates a little bit more to MK Ultra, technocracy, the Southern California military-industrial complex down there. Also interesting to note is, why do neo-Nazis always somehow happen to be around areas where there's a lot of defense contractors? You ever think about that? Like, Southern California, Huntington Beach, all these areas, Cocoa Beach, all these type of areas. So you had all these Operation Paperclip scientists just moving there. Then all of a sudden, neo-Nazis just start popping up or whatnot. Like the spoiled punk suburban kids of just like, Darwinist engineers working for the military-industrial complex, listening to oi oi appropriated bonehead punk music. Who are now just like graffitiing like swastikas and stuff on places. Like I'm saying, all this stuff's connected. Like, and then we have the heaviest hitter of them all, Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. Even though, like, this book is subject to a little controversy, but it does kind of, I'm still getting through it. I'm not going to pretend like I've read all this or anything like that. But what's interesting is that Carol Quigley was a professor at Georgetown University. And who's on the back of it? Bill Clinton. So I heard the call clarified by a professor I had named Carol Quigley, President Bill Clinton. And this talks about kind of what, Jay Dyer kind of talks about, what I'm kind of talking about or whatnot, even though Jay hasn't really talked about Catcher in the Rye, the whole connection over there with Silicon Valley, which I'm going to kind of talk about more and more talks. But this is a good book that talks about banking, the East Coast American establishment and whatnot. So, in summary, man, like, it's just crazy stuff. JD Salinger and the Nazis, CIC guy. He wasn't a big player, but Henry Kissinger was. And they helped to get Nazis over into the United States by forging their documents, basically. And they helped to do Operation Paperclip. But don't worry about Operation Paperclip, because there was other operations such as Stay Behind units, which even connects to like the Turkish Grey Wolves. And what was Turkey known for? Even as far back as the early 1800s with early American trade? Heroin. Catcher in the Rye. The book that everybody says is a mind control book, even though it's not. Lolita. Nabokov. Old guys messing around with young women. Sound like Jeffrey Epstein. Even JD Salinger himself was attracted to young women throughout his life. So what's going on here? You know what I'm saying? What's going on? Jeffrey Epstein, technocracy, CIC, Nazis, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was actually helped organized by a former Nazi, Otto von Bolschwing, who was actually talked about in the San Jose Mercury in the early 80s. Hitler's collaboration with Hollywood, Louis Mayer, Louis Mayer's a Russian Jew. He can still sell movies to Nazi Germany and all this type of stuff, make money. Even though I assume he would probably know that this guy wants to exterminate people off the planet. Maybe that was a part of the goal all along. Get rid of the secular, normal, everyday, hardworking, law-abiding Jews that just want to be peaceful and love their neighbor or whatnot, just so they can force Aliyah back to Israel. The Beast Reawakens. This is a good book. Talks about, they talk about the CIC in here as well. They also talk about how the far right, honestly, with Russia and the West, how the Nazis were able to play both of those sides and bide their time in order to basically wait till the world hit a moment of severe crisis, like in the wake of globalism, the refugee crisis, all that, in order to make a resurgence. But they're doing it in very coded ways, such as through Russian Orthodoxy. And at the same time, I'm not hating on Russian Orthodox or the Russian people or anybody who's Orthodox, because Orthodox people have always been a part of America. But I'm saying is that when it comes to that element, oh, that's going to be called out. Hitler's Jewish soldiers. You're starting to see how the world kind of runs here, But I'm probably gonna make another video here soon, and thank you. It's going down. Think for yourself.